Good morning. In many TV comedies and dramas, a key component is the fall guy, the one over whom the central characters are always getting one over on, having the last laugh on, the subject of the one-liner. And the story from the gospel is can be seen a little bit like that sometimes, that Jesus here is preaching in the temple in Holy Week, and the chief priests and the Pharisees are like those guys that we can see them a bit like pantomime villains, trying to catch Jesus out whilst falling into their own traps and never working out for them. And we're interested onlookers, seeing what's going on and being quite amused by them sort of failing each time. But with these things, there is far more going on and some things for us to take from as well. So if we had time to look at the wider story, of which is kind of the third of the the questions and things that Jesus and the chief priests are talking about, we'll see that it starts off with them coming and they're wanting to catch Jesus out and talk about where is your authority from? And he says, I'll answer you if you tell me, where John got his authority from. Was he a prophet? Which they don't want to answer because they think it might upset the crowd. And then Jesus then says about the two sons who a father says, come and help me in the vineyard to pick the fruit, or apple orchard if you're reading one of Elijah's books. And then one son says, yes, I'll help, and doesn't. And the other one says, no, I won't help. And then he does. And Jesus says to them, which one pleased his father? You can read these others later on if you like. And then Jesus then follows it up with this story that Sarah read to us, a story of a vineyard. And some parables can be quite obscure, and we're trying to work out what is the meaning, what is the imagery and symbolism. And sometimes even the disciples were asking Jesus, what on earth is this all about? What are you meaning about this? But here, it's not quite the same, because Jesus has lifted a lot of this story straight from Isaiah 5. Again, you can look at that later. I haven't got time to look at it now. And that's a song about a vineyard that God has planted and created. And most people, and certainly the Pharisees and chief priests, would immediately recognise that, at how much Jesus had just lifted and taken out, before then giving it a bit of a twist. So in that story, as we heard, the owner plants a vineyard and builds the infrastructure to create a productive agricultural enterprise, which many of the people there would immediately recognise from places that they'd seen. The owner then goes away and rents out the vineyard. Wouldn't be unusual. Many landowners would be absentee landowners renting things out. He then sends people to collect the harvest or his rent. And here it does deviate a little bit from Isaiah, because the people are sent, and then the tenants, the farmers, beat up, and the people sent, the servants, refuse to give what's due and sends them on their way. And finally, the son is sent, the heir, and the son and the tenants then kill him. And Jesus asks the loaded question: what should the owner do? And with the Pharisees and chief priests, almost certainly they were the key landowners at the time, they immediately slip into that role. They immediately see things from that viewpoint and say what should happen. And I love that translation. He will bring those wretches to a wretched end. Only for Jesus to point out that he's actually speaking against them. They've been caught out with how they have viewed it. The tenants have not produced the harvest required for the owner, which, if you go back to Isaiah, is clearly stated as being justice and righteousness. And they've not identified and recognised the Son or his authority, which Jesus links to himself. And Jesus then emphasises that by bringing in another metaphor, moving from agriculture to construction. Quoting Psalm 118, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvellous in our eyes." Psalm 118 is probably one of these psalms that people would sing as they made their way to Jerusalem. And as it was the week before Passover, many of the people who had been there would have been singing it as they made their way up the hill to Jerusalem and possibly into the temple itself. It's all about the temple coming into the gates. And Jesus is telling them that he is the cornerstone, the crucial bit that holds it all together. The part that the stone that you take all your angles and measurements from, but one that wasn't recognised by the builders. The one that wasn't recognised by people, they didn't see the value, they didn't recognise that was the particular piece and its worth. It can be translated in different ways. I did check, and in fact, I think the literal translation is kind of head of a corner, but it's generally people who kind of get over the meaning by calling the cornerstone, the capstone, the foundation stone. This is the important bit of the building, and one that is vital in its role. Now, I have no DIY skills and very limited knowledge of building, despite a granddad of mine being a builder and bricklayer, and then his dad and granddad having similar jobs. One even of them, I've discovered, built the Methodist chapel that they went to. But even I know that there are parts of a structure that are crucial for its integrity. So some of the property programmes, which Becky likes watching, they talk about renovations and changes and how we could improve the building, knocking through this room to that room, doing extensions, doing this, that, the other. And sometimes they have all these plans and then somebody will say, you can't actually do that because if you knock that bit down, the whole bit, the structure would come down. Jesus describes himself as the cornerstone, holding everything together, the one that we line everything up from. And yet the tenants, the religious leaders, didn't recognise him, or perhaps they chose not to recognise him, because if they did, that might affect their life, that might affect how they saw things, their status, their interpretations. They were the guardians of the temple where this confrontation took place. But this in itself wasn't enough to stop them veering off course. If we take our eyes off God, even with the best of intentions, then we can end up going off a bit wonky. And it's easy when we read a passage like this in the Gospels just to be the interested bystanders, smiling perhaps as the religious leaders kind of get their comeuppance. They've fallen into that trap and Jesus kind of has to correct them. But he was also speaking to the crowds around. He knew that there were other people who were listening in. And by extension, as it's written in the Gospels, for us to take things from and hear his words today as well. The challenge for us is to ensure that God is holding everything together in our lives and the one whom we measure things against and that we align ourselves with. It's an important metaphor used various times in the Old Testament and New. Later on, both Paul and Peter go on to use it in their letters, urging the early church to make Jesus their cornerstone. And here at CCC, our values, which we've come up with, guided by the leadership and endorsed by the church, have God first and centre. I mean, the vision begins seeking God. So, and then going on to the values, which if you haven't memorised those, they're very helpfully around the room. For instance, over here, and the green one, growing, it starts off growing in relationship with God. So even at these parts, that God is included and identified and acknowledged. Because it can be easy to drift off, being busy doing good things, and we may need to be reminded every so often, as do we have God at our centre? Are we aligning ourselves with God and his purposes for us? And just as Jesus wasn't recognised in the story, or in real life by some people, the prophets that God sent were also not recognised by those they were sent to, sometimes abused, sometimes killed. Isaiah, who wrote his book, and including that song of the vineyard, according to other accounts that aren't in the Old Testament, himself was killed by being cut in half. Their authority from God and their words weren't recognised. And also, do we recognise Jesus around us and who he is speaking to? Just as the prophets weren't recognised either, are we open to God speaking to us? Where is he leading us? Just a few weeks ago, James was speaking about Moses and the burning bush, and asked us to think about where we'd seen God around us. Might be in other people, songs, stories, nature, all sorts of ways. Because I'm guessing that Moses wouldn't necessarily have expected God to have been speaking to him through a burning bush. But God can speak to us in all sorts of different ways. And are we open to that? The challenge is, are we open to recognising those who God has sent and ways that God is trying to communicate us and guide us? We might want to think back in our lives. Are there times when we've heard God speaking to us through an unexpected source, through someone we didn't expect? God doesn't always speak to us through the obvious places and the obvious people. Many times he will do, but there are other times there are other ways as well. Remember many years ago going to an evening service, and the person who was preaching, I thought, I don't always fully see eye to eye with them, not always on the same wavelength. And I must admit, I wasn't particularly expecting much from that. But as it turned out, if he'd come round a few evenings earlier, chatted to me, found out exactly what was going on, and then wrote it just for me, I don't think it could have been more direct of God speaking straight into a particular situation. And I'd realised that I'd underestimated him and how God could speak. So here in this story, as Jesus turns the table on the religious leaders with the parable about tenants in the vineyard, he's also speaking to us today. We're called to make Jesus our cornerstone, both individually in our own lives and corporately in the church, and keep our senses open for recognising him around us and what he has to say to us today.
Good morning. I'm Gemma. For those who maybe don't know me, I joined CCC about 6 years ago. I'm married to the tallest Paul in the church. And I've got 2 children, Caitlin and Ben, who you probably see me running around after from time to time. About 4 months ago, Dave asked me if I'd like to have a go at preaching. And I will admit my first instinct was to say no. I was going to say it wasn't my thing. I didn't know enough. I had no idea what to say. And I didn't think I was the right person to do it. But while some of those thoughts do still persist, I felt a nagging push from within me that said, maybe you can do it. And it wouldn't go away. So I'm giving it a go. My main concern, I guess, with talking to you all was that I'm just not knowledgeable enough to talk to other adults about the Bible. My comfort zone is teenagers. So imagine my delight and relief that when I read this passage, I found that Paul, the great missionary and theologian, said he doesn't have it all together. And even he isn't an expert in his role for Jesus. I also worried I wouldn't be able to find much to talk about. But actually, the more I've read and considered just this passage, the more I found within it. And even on Friday, when I was trying to arrange my thoughts into some kind of logical order, I just kept writing down more ideas about different things I could say. And digging deeper into just this one passage of this one book has been so inspiring. And actually, just for that reason alone, I'm glad I said yes. Even though it's still scary. So in the first part of this passage, Paul talks about how many reasons he has to have confidence in the flesh, and that he previously considered this kind of list of qualifications as gains in his life, just as many other people around him would have done. But he soon goes on to consider these human-made standards against the incomparable riches that come from following Jesus. He talks of righteousness that comes from faith, and that this kind of righteousness is so much more glorious and exciting than the righteousness that could be found in the law. And while this part of the passage alone could be discussed for hours, it's actually the last 2 verses of the passage that have really struck me. To me, the final 2 verses of this passage provide both a reassurance and a challenge to us as we think about our lives, past, present, and future. Paul stresses in these verses that he's not arrived at his goal in his faith. He's not a completed work, but a work in progress. And his aim is to work hard towards a life focused on Jesus. What a reassurance it is to know that we don't need to be the finished article to live with Jesus. And what a challenge it is that we should keep striving and working hard to move forward with him. We look back in our lives for lots of reasons, to remember good things, to relive great experiences, to acknowledge the people we once knew, to consider how our lives have changed or how the world's changed. We compare our past and our present and our future. And of course, many of those memories and comparisons can be really positive, empowering, and joyful. But most of us probably also look back at times or points in our lives with sadness, regret, frustration, anger, or embarrassment. We wonder what we would have said or done differently. We worry about how our actions might have been perceived. And we fear not being able to undo our past actions. Sometimes these reflections are so powerful they stop us being able to move on at all. And how freeing it is then to read here that Paul says we're to forget the things of the past and instead focus our energy on what is yet to come. I had a friend at school when I was in the sixth form, and I trained for 10 tours with him. I'm no longer in touch with him. I haven't been for a long time. But I can remember we were on one training walk and we were towards the end. And if you've done anything on Dartmoor, you'll know there's very long stretches of very boggy moorland, which are very difficult to keep going through. And we just kind of got to the end of one of those and we were deciding where we were heading to next. And he was really tired and he kept sort of saying, I just don't know if I can keep going. So I said, well, why don't you look back at how far we've come? Isn't that a great encouragement to see what we've just done? Hoping it might cheer him up. And instead of thanking me, he said, I never look back in life, and carried on walking. And it totally baffled me at the time. And I felt a bit put out, to be honest, because I thought I was going to be really encouraging, and it'd just been totally shot down. But I couldn't understand why he wouldn't want to look back. And oddly, it's the only interaction I can really remember with this person. But it stayed with me all these years. I've thought about it loads of times. And it was the first thing that came into my head when I read this passage. I'm not sure I still fully agree with him, but I can see how healthy that outlook is. Paul says we can forget what's behind and strive towards what's ahead. But this isn't to say that the things that have happened in our lives are insignificant or irrelevant or not important. I think Paul's talking more about where our focus should be. It's a great encouragement, isn't it, to look back over our lives and see God's hand at work in us, or to consider the difference perhaps in our lives before and after we started following Jesus. I don't think Paul's suggesting we disregard any of those things. Neither is he saying our past doesn't shape us or make us the people that we are. But I think he's suggesting a change of focus, to alter where we expend our spiritual energy by actively moving forward towards the prize for which we've been called. We're called to forge forwards with Christ as our focus. We can learn from the past, but we're not bound to the things that we've done. Instead of being kind of chained to our past mistakes, maybe we need to move forward knowing that we carry Christ's forgiveness with us. There's a saying in sport, which is that you're only as good as your last result. And the aim of this is to encourage either an individual or a team not to rest on their laurels, but to keep moving forward and keep making progress. I've played sport in various capacities my whole life, and I love it. So this passage speaks to me on more than one level. Paul's goal is perfection, to live like Christ. He's not yet achieved his goal, and he doesn't expect to during his earthly life. But just like a runner, he's focused on his goal, aiming to complete his race. And just like a runner, he can't focus on that goal that's ahead of him if he keeps looking back. Much like running a race, though, the most encouraging part to me of all of this is that we're not expected to run our race alone. The most powerful images I find from any high-profile running race are the ones of runners helping other runners who are struggling. I can think of so many examples, and they always make me cry. We run our race for Jesus alongside all other Christians. And we can encourage each other by striving towards the goal of Christ together. Hebrews 12:1 says, we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, so we can run with perseverance the race set out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. What an encouragement and a reassurance that is. And the challenge in all of this, I think, is to consider, are we focusing on our future with Christ? Or are we spending too much time thinking about the past? And how do we shift that balance so that we are striving towards the goal of life with Jesus? I struggled with feeling like I qualified to share my thoughts with you all this morning. But Paul says here we're not called to tick boxes to make us a good Christian. He's held out his hand to us. Jesus has held out his hand to us. All we are required to do is take it. We're called to focus on our future with Christ without being hindered by things of the past. And not only that, we're called to run our race for Jesus with other people. And that seems like quite an exciting prospect. So the question I've been asking myself when I've been thinking about this, and the one I'm going to leave you with, is what is it in our lives that we need to forget or leave behind to help us move forwards in our walk with Jesus?